So we know what we're here for, flight clinic preparation session. Want to call out also in addition that we're giving contribution credit to Major Sobel. I don't know if he's online tonight, but he's also contributed to these to this presentation tonight. Roughly, this is what we're going to go through: our introduction, our topics. We'll explore them, and then we'll talk about how you can do the flight clinic. The flight clinic itself consists of this presentation. For those of us who weren't able to make it tonight, we are recording, so they can go through the recording of it for some background information. Before any flight, but particularly for something such as the Emergency Procedures Clinic, a ground briefing. We've also found that taking the time ahead of time and using, for example, a Teams call tends to be a really great opportunity rather than just kind of, hanging out at the plane and doing a briefing just before you fly. And what's most important about this is that I think you, or excuse me, not that I think, you can customize your flight for your experience and goals. And what's been introduced to the flight clinic is, in addition to instructor pilots, groups may authorize mentor pilots who are not CAP instructor pilots. So you'll check with your group, either DO or DOV, if you are looking for a broader range than just the instructor pilots available. We can take a brief look at some refresher topics that they relate to the flight clinic themselves. First, a little bit about regulatory review, things that have come up. Talk a little bit about short field takeoffs and landings. We've had a few tail strikes in CAP within recent times. It's good to talk about that a little bit. Talk a little bit about electrical system. That's another area. We've had a number of alternator failures and electrical system problems in our aircraft. So a little time is spent on that. And the point being current, being proficient prevents these from becoming emergency procedure situations. Be prepared. In the emergency procedures clinic, or emergency procedures topics, we'll talk about the power loss on takeoff and the impossible turn, engine fire or number of fire scenarios. We'll talk about altitude loss during turns. We'll talk more about that when we get there. I think you'll find that a valuable part of the clinic. And we talk about power loss, glide to landing. Landing with no electricity, and which leads to landing with no flaps. Talk a little about unusual attitudes in IMC, and landing without elevator control, and a flat tire. So let's talk through the refresher topics, but we'll move quickly. During your clinic maneuvers, as you really will for all of your practice and proficiency maneuvers in flying, we will make sure that everything that you accomplish is completed above 1,500 feet AGL, which means that in most cases, you'll be starting considerably higher. What 7-1 calls SFLs, or simulated forced landing, you may, if we're doing it out in a field or in non-congested areas, the aircraft may come as low as 500 feet AGL before recovering. If, however, you are at an airport, an authorized landing surface, as long as it's 3,000 feet, you may continue a simulated forced landing to the pavement, assuming you have a CAP instructor on board. If not, then it's 5,000 feet. So one note here, since we now allow CAP mentor pilots to support, authorized CAP mentor pilots to be your right seater through the clinic, take note that they still have the 5,000 foot restriction, or you will have the 5,000 foot restriction, depending on whether you have an IP for 3,000 or a mentor pilot at 5. Okay, a couple review notes on short field landings and takeoffs. Review and follow the POH procedures. Numbers are in there. Always, always, always brief for an engine failure. You really should be doing this as part of your emergency procedures before every departure is what you're going to do in the event of an engine failure. But what makes this somewhat different is that a short field takeoff is a high angle of attack maneuver. If the engine hesitates or quits, you have a very short window and you've got to make a pretty big pitch change. So it's a big push. You need to be ready, preloaded for this. Short field landings, okay, don't force it to make your spot. And if you're not going to make your spot, go around, try it again. Because if this were in fact truly a short field, you would need to go around, because if you're not making your spot, you run the risk of not making or not stopping on your runway. As I mentioned earlier, we've had a few tail strikes in CAP, right? Be wary of those. And also in our heavier aircraft, the 182s and 206s, the descent rate on short field landings, if you're doing it at a high pitch angle, in the case, for example, you're trying to avoid an obstacle, the descent rate can become significant to the point where you will probably need some power to arrest the descent rate before you come down. And that you, again, have enough aerodynamic authority, again, that's airspeed, that your airspeeds are within range so that you have the authority to basically round out the aircraft and touch it down at less than wheel bending speed. Let's talk just briefly about emergency versus abnormal. I hinted at it earlier when I said currency and proficiency can make sure that the abnormal doesn't become the emergency. So for the purpose of at least this flight clinic, we'll say that an emergency threatens the safety of the aircraft or of persons on board or on the ground, and the safe completion of the flight is in question. Whereas an abnormal situation is one in which you basically cannot continue the flight using normal procedures. So shall we say you can't complete the mission as planned. But the safety of the flight, the safety of the personnel, the aircraft, or people on the ground is not in question, right? Can lack of preparation turn an abnormal situation into an emergency? I would say yes. Okay, talk a little bit about electrical system issues because they have been coming up. Early detection gives us the most options. The key is make sure electrical system monitoring is in your scan. And once you do detect a problem, start shedding the load, making decisions. And I noted here, you can also try to reset or recycle the alternator master once. It's not something we want to do continually, because if it goes offline a second time, there's likely to be a bigger problem at hand. And the last thing that you need to compound this problem is potentially an electrical fire because you're defeating the either the circuit breakers or the master. Some of our high load items, if we do end up with electrical system problem, keep in mind your flaps are going to require a lot of energy from your battery. Landing gear, if we had them, typically not in our CAP aircraft in this wing. Lighting, radios, all of these can be significant drains on what's left over once your alternator stops charging your battery. Don't know if you've thought about this before, but if you were to have an electrical failure and you had been running on your main battery for a period of time, and you come in to go for a landing, you have enough flaps to land, but what if you don't make the landing? Because I don't know, maybe you're a little uptight, a little nervous about the abnormal situation that you're dealing with. So what if you have to do a go around? Will you have enough battery power to actually retract those flaps so that you can climb? So a consideration here is only use the amount of flaps that you would be able to tolerate in a go around. For most of our aircraft, maybe 10 degrees, maybe even 20, but probably no more than that. So something to think about. Recommend you add alternator failure to your contingency planning for every flight. What are you going to do? In a day flight, maybe I go to an uncontrolled field where I can land. What about a night flight? That becomes potentially a little more of an issue. How do I manage that while I still have the battery power so that I have potentially landing lights and I have flaps? I recommend you know your lost comm procedures. How about a light signal card? Does everybody remember the light signals? If not, it should be one of those probably laminated cards that you keep in your knee board. And what about for tower controlled fields? If you do end up with a full electrical failure, you don't have radios, does it make sense to enter the pattern at unannounced at a busy airport? It's a decision. It's legal, but is it wise? These are the things that should be part of your contingency planning. Related to that is for every IMC flight, have a VMC out. We all know who are IFR pilots, we know that we have procedures to follow. You know, what are our lost comm procedures? You know, where can we go? We can continue our flight. But at some point, if we reach electrical failure, or if we have electrical failure, then our instruments that we require to do an approach are no longer available to us. So have a VMC out in every IMC flight. Make sure that's part of your planning. If you're not going to have one, if you're going to be covering over very large or vast distances of low ceilings, reassess the flight. Is it a flight worth taking? Is the mission important enough that if you had an electrical failure, you've basically eliminated options for yourself? And involve ATC early, because your radios may die soon thereafter. So get them involved in the case so that they can be keeping an eye on you. Even if you lose your transponder, they often can keep primary target information on you. So at least they may know where you are. Now, a comment to make. Oh, sorry, I have one more point to make on this. I apologize. Practice no flap landings. This seems to keep coming up, and it will come up later in the topic too. This is an important thing that should be part of your proficiency routine, practicing your no flap landings. And I will tell you from my Form 5 experience that people who are not practicing them, when asked to practice them, it's a challenge. So it is not something, it's a perishable skill like many other things. Now, briefly, in our older round dial aircraft, detection of electrical failures is somewhat difficult sometimes, or I shouldn't say difficult, but you don't always see it. Maybe you're starting to watch the ammeter run onto the negative side. Maybe the red low voltage light you happen to catch out of the corner of your eye. So you need to be looking for those things and making sure in your scan. How about in a G1000 aircraft? Common Form 5 question might be, what's the first indication that you might see of an alternator failure? Anybody want to hop in on that one? Feel free. I'm just talking to a blank screen.
Low,
so action.
hey, Keith, it's
Go
John.
ahead.
Low volts annunciator, perhaps?
Okay, that is one of the indications, but it might not be the first. Because once at the moment when the alternator fails, our battery may still reside above 24.5 volts for a while.
You don't see any charging of the battery?
You wouldn't, but there might be, is that Andre? Is that there's another indication you might see?
Right, yeah, okay.
Is how
Shilde
about
has her hand up.
Oh, okay. Silka?
Yes, sir. You would see a negative charge on the ammeter.
You would, and how else would that be indicated? Is there any color coding?
Yellow.
Yellow. So potentially the
Yellow.
first time you'd see it would be the yellow indication on the ammeters, and as Silka said, the negative values. And then it will be followed, as was mentioned earlier, you'll potentially have the numbers, the voltage numbers will start to turn red, and you'll have your low voltage annunciator coming on the lower right side of the PFD. So good. Again, this is where the knowledge of how the system works can be an aid to you. Okay, we're going to move into the emergency procedures topics, and what we're going to do is to kind of maybe add to, instead of you have to listen to one of us all night long, George and I will switch back and forth a couple of times. So I'm going to turn it over to George at this point.
All right,
And
thank
if
you.
I
And
can-
I think Keith, you might have to switch slides for me.
Oh, do you want to? Oh, you don't want to present, or I can do it if you want.
Yeah,
That's fine.
yeah, you
Just
can
just
do
say
it.
next when you're ready.
All right, let's do next. So now we're going to the meat of our emergency procedures clinic topics. Now, why we train? We have to realize that a lot of what you've experienced in your training, like the simulated failures in the Form 5 or the flight clinic flights or your primary training, what if this ever happens to you for real, it's not going to be entirely like that. It's not like the engine is going to be happily windmilling, then you're going to look at your instructor, you're both going to be smiling like you're doing a great job. The reality is that this is going to be a high stress situation, because what's going to go through your mind is, oh no, this is real. I'm going to be on the ground in, I don't know, 1 or 2 minutes, and it might not be pretty. That's going to be a high stress situation. And those situations, it's well known from various aspects, various different kinds of training, that will default to our training. The quote you see on the screen was not about general aviation, but it does apply equally to general aviation. We want you to have these automations, these quick responses to get you to the right path. All right, now I'm looking at the background. There we go. Okay, next slide, please. And as I hinted before, reality and training are, not exactly the same. If you mess something up in training, okay, fine, just do it again. Go back, climb to altitude. We'll run through the scenario again. There's no real liability because you can terminate the scenario, and if you do it right. And part of the reason we went through the regulatory review is to not create an emergency by practicing for emergencies. We're going to emphasize that later because it is important. In reality, though, there will be consequences for any errors, and there might be outcomes, unfavorable outcomes. So we want you to be as well prepared for the real thing, because it's going to be higher stress than you might encounter if you haven't encountered one so far. Next slide, please. So this is a famous topic, and it's kind of like a topic of debate among many folks, the possible/impossible turn. But what we mean by that is the case where you're on takeoff, climbing out, the engine quits or produces partial power or hesitates or something, but you don't have enough runway available in front of you. Can you turn back to the same runway, or maybe a parallel runway from the one you took off? Next slide, please. So the question is, can we make it a possible turn? And let's be clear. I mean, the goal of this training here is to get you to, of course, to think about it, but also through the flight is to get to know your aircraft, get to know how it performs, how it would perform in a situation. Of course, practice, build the automation, the muscle memory that we've alluded to. We are not going to give you a hard and fast rule that works for every aircraft, every situation. Remember, if you fly different aircraft, things can change. If the wind is different, things can change. Of course, the runway length, the airport layout. But let's figure out how we can make this turn a little more likely to go well. And of course, you have to remember, it only makes sense to do that when it's less dangerous than not doing it. So I'm sure you've all heard through your primary training, if you're too low to go back, just land at what's in front of you. And it might be the case that you're climbing out, you're not sure if you can come back, but what's ahead of you is nice green fields. Well, do you really want to risk going back, or just land straight ahead? Yeah, it might not be as pretty as landing as a runway, but at least it will be probably a safe landing. Click. So let's decide how to do it. One more. And there's going to be a big part of the training. Let's determine how much altitude we need. Now, as I said, airplane, runway length, wind are all practical aspects of if this actually happened to you, if you're actually going to turn back. But we can, at least through this flight clinic, determine how an airplane performs, how much altitude it needs to turn back and line up. So next slide. So this is how we recommend you do this. Now, of course, this is going to be at altitude. Please, nobody do this on an actual climb out from a runway. we want you to do this maneuver such that you complete the maneuver no lower than 2000 AGL. Higher is better, but nobody do this on 10,000 because the plane does perform a little differently there. So we want you to conclude at 2000, which means that you're probably going to have to start higher. How much higher? Well, depends on the aircraft and so on. 35, 4,000, 5,000, maybe 6,000. All should do it. Next, or click. So we're going to simulate this situation at altitude. And when you're taking off at the runway, you're lined up with the runway. So in this case, you're going to line up with a ground reference. If you find a road or a distant runway or something that is straight, you can sort of line up with it. That's good. And then you set for climb power, trim for airspeed at VY. So you're simulating a climb out situation. Next. And then slowly retard throttle to idle. Now, I do have to insert an asterisk here. If you have like a 300 horsepower engine and you go from climb power to idle, well, that might not be the best idea for the engine because of shock cooling. So talk with your instructor. I think you can, if you're nice and do it gently, you can do this in 182, but please monitor your cooling rates. But when you do go to idle, note the altitude where you started. If you have a G1000, you can set the altitude selector, also known as the altitude bag. Next. Wait 5 seconds. I'm going to ask you about that later, but we ask you to wait for 5 seconds before you do anything. The only thing you're going to do in those 5 seconds is drop the nose to establish speed, but please go straight ahead. And note the speed loss. Note how quickly you go from VY to close to stall. And then start your turn. Going back to the runway. We prefer to turn it into the wind so that you stay closer to the runway environment. Next. And then roll into a turn. Now, there's a whole discussion. There are great articles about this, like how many degrees of bank. Well, it's an optimization problem we're not going to get into. What we suggest, especially for your first times, is a 45-degree bank because you've done this before. It's called steep turns. So you should be familiar with it. But do this turn such that you maintain glide speed. So you're going to lose altitude. You're going to drop the nose to maintain glide speed and constant speed throughout this maneuver. So I promised you a question now. Well, actually I have 3 for you, and let's try to make this interactive. So we ask you to wait for 5 seconds. Why wait for 5 seconds? Anybody?
To account for the surprise.
Yep. To account for the surprise. Good. Is 5 seconds, do you think, is that optimistic or pessimistic? Meaning, is 5 seconds too short compared to what would be reality?
I don't know, because depends on how surprised you are.
You might be very, very surprised, depending on what happened. But yeah, okay, it's not something that we gave you the answer for. There's no great answer for anyway. It depends, but in many cases, this is optimistic. But anyway, 5 seconds should do it for this flight cleaning. So in this turn, are you going to lose altitude? Yes, right. And that was an obvious one, I guess. So then, do you know the stall speeds for given bank angles for your aircraft? So let's think of a G1000 182, and I know there are different aircraft out there. It's just the one I think that's common around the wing. How much does the stall speed become if you're in a 45-degree bank turn?
I'm assuming it would be like 55.
Okay, that's a good guess, and that's the table we have here. This is from a G1000 182, and of course, the center of gravity does affect it. For 45-degree bank, you can see there's let's see, most forward. Let's say most forward center of gravity, just like CFI, instructor, and then you in the training, 2 people in the front. 45-degree bank, the stall speed with no flaps is going to go from 51 to 61 indicated. So, it's quite an increase. And if you do the math for your glide speed, it does mean that, you still have a margin, but it's not a significant margin anymore. So please be attentive with your glides, with airspeed control, both in the real situation and, of course, and in training. Now, why wait 5 seconds? Somebody said the surprise. Well, there's a term for that. It's called the startle effect, and turns out it's responsible for many accidents and incidents in aviation, and of course, in other factors. The gist of this is as follows. We have 2 paths from receiving an input, like we notice something, to taking action. The path that's at the top, that's the thinking path. The path that's at the bottom is the more emotional, automatic path. The path at the bottom is the fastest one. And it's one that sort of tends to be activated. So you notice your engine going out, there's a bang, there's a sound, or something else happened, you get startled. And the path at the bottom is responsible for like increasing your heart rate or your blood pressure, basically getting you ready for the flight or fight response that is sort of ingrained into us. The problem is that path also tends to, from the flight response, tends to take you away from the danger and also impair thinking. And the study that we cite at the top basically says that this effect rather, can impair 100% logical or high quality, I guess, thinking for up to 30 seconds. Now, if you lose your engine at 1,000 feet, those 30 seconds are really precious. So we do want, again, going back to what I said earlier, is we want you to have this automations, muscle memory, so that path is also productive and it gets you going in the right path, the right actions before your thinking kicks in. So next slide, I think, Keith, is that where you take over? No, the possible turn. All right.
Nope.
So
I think you're still going.
Okay. And then, yeah, that's right. So to complete the maneuver at altitude, so remember, we were going straight ahead, power to idle, start to turn. You're going to turn more than 180 degrees, because if you turned 180, you wouldn't get to the runway. You would parallel the runway. So you're going to turn 180 degrees plus 30 or 45. And if you have a good reference point, like a long road that you're flying over, so you would be sort of intercepting going back to the road at a 30 or 45 degree altitude. And then you would roll, and then after making that turn, you would roll, you would turn on the other side. So let's say that your initial turn was left, the 180 plus 30. Now you're going to make a small right turn once you're lined up with your road, which is really the runway. So you're basically lining up to land on the runway that you just took off. Next. And then that's where you want to mark the altitude. So you took a note of the altitude at the beginning where you put throttle to idle. Now you're going to make a note of this altitude, and that is how much altitude the airplane lost throughout the maneuver. Now, be careful that this does not, as soon as you roll your wings, this does not mean you're at the runway. You could still have a little flying to do to get there. Now, of course, it depends on runway length, exactly how much runway you use on takeoff. There are many factors, but do take that into account. That altitude does not necessarily mean you can get back to the runway. And yeah, more altitude to stabilize your approach. As Keith said, you might need to pick up some speed to flare in some aircraft. Next. And you need a margin, because remember, especially during the turn, the stall speed is closer, but also if this happens to you for real, you're not going to do probably your perfect flying. So your airspeed control is not going to be as precise, and maybe your headings are not going to be as precise, or your bank angles we said 45, but are you really going to keep 45 throughout? So if you determine that, hey, my airplane can do this maneuver at 600 feet, well, okay, add some more because I might need to fly a little more to get the runway. Well, then what this last bullet is saying, well, adds even some more for all the imperfections of the real thing. And again, every day is different because the wind might be different. So a headwind, for example, is more favorable. It keeps you towards the runway environment. All right, next. And there's a lot of material on the impossible turn. A lot of material. This is just two. There's some FAA material. There's an FAA course. There's some also great articles that argue about the different bank angles. There's also a video recently from AOPA that basically evaluated the different aircraft makes and models on how well they do. And one of the conclusions was that the speed, the ground speed, is actually a big factor in this, in the success rate going back. Okay, I think next, and this might be where you take over.
Yeah, I think we're about to switch, but I wanted to see if anybody had questions on this. This usually generates this area topic generates some questions for George. Okay.
George, you said something about ground speed as opposed to airspeed. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I wasn't comparing ground speed and airspeed. All I was saying is that faster aircraft tend to go away from the runway environment by the time they reach a certain altitude, say 800 feet, where the simulated failure happens. And that is a big factor in going back. It doesn't really apply to us very well here because it's not like we fly bonanzas, but it is a good video from AOPA that was released a few months ago, and I would encourage you to watch it sometime.
Okay.
I think, Mark, you had your hand up for a question. Andre?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, when I saw some videos about engine failures, and you talked about the 5-second rule, I mean, I think sometimes also it's the matter of how the engine quits. You know, if it's a catastrophic failure and it just propeller stops instantly, that's one thing. But I guess when would you recommend if, for example, you start noticing some weird noise and maybe like a diminishing power? I mean, at what point do you sort of execute this this type of maneuver or start basically doing like an emergency landing?
So if you're on climb out and your engine doesn't feel normal, and that could be a sound, or you might notice that it's giving you less power than you used to, assuming you know the airplane well enough, why would you not turn back? I mean, this is your engine. At that point, the engine is doing you a favor. It's giving you a warning sign, but it's not taking the power right away. Like it's helping you to go back. Now,
do we start the pattern, I guess, really early just in case and land, or do we declare an emergency and like do the turn like right away?
I mean, I don't think we can give you a formula for every situation, right? There's going to be some judgment. All I'm saying is never let the safe conclusion of the flight in question. It's much better to overreact than underreact. But if it's a small indication that there's a 737 right behind you, yeah, okay, sure, you might do something different. But I'm not aware of a controller who would have a problem with that unless it created another conflict and the actions were reasonable. Now, if we're talking about an electrical failure, like Keith was saying before, that does not immediately affect the safety of the flight unless maybe you're at night or in the cloud. So then, yeah, you can end the pattern. But if you have any doubt that the engine will keep working in the next second, I would at least go back. But again, it's a judgment call.
So we had exactly that happen last week, or maybe the week before, when General Falco was flying the 206 Zelda from San Diego. And he did the impossible turn. And I can tell you how the sequence of events went. He was in the left seat and David Boehm was in the right seat. And we took off and we got up to just under 900 feet and he pulled the power back a little bit. At that time, the engine just really started hiccuping and coughing, and there was, the RPMs were going down to 400 RPM. I mean, it was really, that engine wasn't going to go any farther. We were done. And before he even, or simultaneously, I was in the back seat. The two people in the front instantly looked around to see where we could go. LAX was too far away. Hawthorne, there's nowhere to go. There was only one choice, and that was to go back to the airport. So while he started the impossible turn, he also initiated a mayday call and declared an emergency. Then David Boehm in the right seat took over the radio while General Falco continued that turn. You can imagine at 900 feet where there wasn't much space left, there was no way the air traffic controller, we were on, because we were on an IFR flight plan, we were on approach LA Center, wanted to hand us over to the tower, and we just said, no, you call the tower, we're too busy. And ultimately the tower, I don't know how it got switched over, but ultimately they wanted us to enter the pattern, and the answer was no, we're not entering the pattern because we couldn't have gotten around the pattern, and we landed backwards to the wind. And air traffic control was still trying to catch up to us. By the time we were on the runway, they were just asking us how many people on board and how much fuel are you carrying. So the answer is, I think well taken, is every situation is different. that was one of those. How did that happen without anybody getting hurt or the airplane getting damaged? It was one of those impossible scenarios. But because General Felka and Colonel Boehm spoke at length before we took off about what would happen if we had an emergency, they both knew exactly what their roles were and what would happen if we lost power when we did, and it worked.
Thanks, sir. And may I just emphasize one point that Colonel Rush just made, which is the engine started having trouble when a power adjustment was made. And I don't have any strong data to support this. I couldn't find any, but there is some saying that if an engine is going to act up or fail, it's more likely, I don't know how much more likely, to do that when you change something with it. And that is one recommendation. Maybe you can do the climb checklist at 1,000 feet instead of 500 feet, just for that reason. But thank you, sir, for that. And I think, Keith, it's over to you.
Mark, well, I'll get a couple more questions. We'll see if we can get through them. Mark?
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to add a comment that you don't always have to go back to the runway you just took off from. So sometimes, like Fresno, Mather, Oakland, there's parallel runways. Sometimes there's a runway that's not quite a 180-degree turn. So just in the back of your head, ask yourself, is going back to the runway I just left the best choice?
I'm actually glad you said that because we have an exercise with Oakland later. But yes,
I was going to say you need to pay Mark $20 as your straight man there to got you teed right up for your future slides. That's great. And then Sheesh, you had a question, I think.
Yes, I think thanks a lot, Colonel Vedder, for talking about how the ATC interaction went. For me, like one of the big, the thing that really gives me makes me nervous about trying to do something like this is what if there's traffic taking off? Do you have any tips on how you would avoid sort of just coming back into traffic? Or for Colonel Vedder, what precautions did you take to make sure that you didn't run into someone who's taking off?
Colonel Vedder, do you want to respond to that, or should I?
So, the answer was there was no time. From the time we, our wheels left the ground, the time we were back on the ground was 3 minutes. So we just let everybody know, we didn't do anything more than, or they didn't do anything more than declare an emergency, make the Mayday call, and announce we're on our way back to. In this case, it was runway 7. They wanted us to land on 25, but we couldn't make it around the pattern. So we said we're turning around, we're landing runway 7, and I mean there was just no choice. It was that or go into a house, and so I guess it was a kind of a wing and a prayer kind of situation that we were lucky nobody was on the way out, and conflicted with us because there was just no alternative.
Okay, thank you, sir. I think we'll continue on now. I'm hoping we'll have some time also at the end for more questions, but it's great. It's nice to have this kind of discussion, so thank you all. We'll move on. Our next section, something that we typically add in the syllabus for the Emergency Procedures Clinic is a review of different fire procedures. Know the POH procedures. We all know that we have bold-faced items on the emergency procedures checklist for our aircraft. How many people really have them memorized? The first several steps of each of the different situations are a required memory item. But let's talk about, in terms of engine fires, from a very pragmatic point of view, let's prioritize what we do. And I think what you're going to find is the checklists actually match this pretty well. If you have a fire, the number one thing to do is starve it. In the case of an engine fire, it's most likely, well, it's, at least as far as what we can control, is fuel. So the first thing that happens and you'll see this on your checklist, the first thing is pull the mixture, turn off the fuel, then turn off the fuel pump. Basically, all the sources of ignition you're trying to remove, or all the sources of fuel you're trying to remove. Now, lower vents closed. So basically, because this is bleeding off the engine compartment, the idea is let's prevent any smoke or anything from entering the cabin from there, but not necessarily the upper vents at this point. What about electrical fire? Again, we're going to starve it of fuel. The fuel in this case is the current. So if you have an electrical fire, the first issue is getting all of your electricity turned off. Certainly your master, your standby battery are the key factors there. And in the case of an electrical fire, the recommendation of the POH for the Cessna aircraft is all vents closed. Because basically they don't want the drafts to flash the fire up. So all vents are closed. So beware that if you now pull your fire extinguisher in the intent to discharge it and put out the fire in the cabin, keep in mind you now have a very toxic environment. So there isn't a lot of time, hence one of the important reasons why we do have the memorized checklist items. Basically, get the electricity off, close the vents, get the fire extinguished so that you can reopen the vents and vent that both smoke and toxic environment. I won't go into it too much right now, but some people actually carry smoke hoods. And I imagine probably it only takes one time of either a fire or a near fire that probably convinces you to get one. Okay, let's talk a little bit about wing fire. A fire typically is going to be more likely at the outboard than the root because that's where a lot of your electrical items are, your strobes, navigation lights, or landing light systems. So they're on the outside of where the fuel tanks are and our integrated tanks in the wings in our aircraft. So our objective is really, let's keep the fire away from the fuel tank. How do we do that? Well, if we have an outboard fire, here's your memory aid. Step on the fire. So if you step on the fire, use opposite aileron, which is a forward slip, what you'll find is that the wing is raised up and it's now downwind. So basically it's keeping the fire away from progressing along the wing towards the fuel tank. I find this just a great exercise for everyone to do. We don't do slips that often. Here's an opportunity we do a slip and we actually continue to fly the aircraft. It'll give you a chance to find out, does the aircraft actually, can you maintain altitude in a full forward slip like this? So it's just another valuable experience, as George mentioned earlier, in getting to know the aircraft you fly. A root fire is a little more problematic because if you slip the aircraft to pull the fire away from the fuel tank, guess where it puts the fire? Towards the cabin. So you have to think about that. It's what's your best option of only bad options? Okay, so you tried to put out the fire. In this case, we're talking about electrical fire. It's not working, or we're still in bad shape. We have smoke or whatever else that we can't clear. Now what? Well, this is where the emergency descents come into play. So how do we do an emergency descent? Lots of ways. I don't know, does anyone know, do any of our aircraft, the 172, 182, or 206s, do they have an emergency descent procedure? Anybody familiar with it? Okay. Turns out the only one of our current aircraft that has one actually published is the Turbo 206, Turbo 206 H model that we have actually has an emergency descent procedure. In that case, it's very similar to the fire procedure where you dive down straight ahead to get yourself down. However, bank turn to come with an emergency, do the spiraling turn down. This is also a good one to practice. It's just another good control maneuver to basically keep yourself over a spot. Again, remember with wind, you're going to be constantly adjusting, but it's another good exercise in controlling your aircraft. And the more we do these things, the more they become muscle memory, the better we're going to be at doing them in an emergency. I don't remember the exact quote George gave us, but essentially you're only going to be as good as your training level in an emergency situation. What else comes up? How about an inoperative airspeed indicator? Is that an emergency? I'm not sure about that. In our aircraft, when you fly them for more than a few hours, you should be developing a good sight picture. You should be able to tell what level altitude is for a given power setting. When you're on approach, you should be able to tell with first, second, what does that pitch angle generally look like? Now, the old phrase, power plus attitude equals airspeed, it's essentially correct. So if we don't have an airspeed indicator, we should be able to use our sight picture and knowledge of what our typical power settings are. And we should be able to maintain a reasonable constant airspeed, even without the use of the airspeed indicator. Now, here, what we're demonstrating here is a little bit basically what's called the spot method. And this is what helps us essentially, create a constant glide path for ourselves. If we're staring at the numbers and we're watching the numbers go either up or down the windscreen, that tells us that we're either going long or short. There's really only one point on that runway where nothing is moving in your windscreen. And that's essentially your aiming point at that, or the spot, right? It's not the spot you'll land at, but it's the spot you'll arrive at if you maintain that attitude and that glide path. So we use that. If you have a particular spot you want to, we can use that spot moving up or down to adjust our glide path. We don't need the airspeed controller for it. What we need is an idea of what we're looking at outside. What's our sight picture, what we're used to. And if you're really fortunate, you have one of our new airplane system on it, and in which case the is really not needed for the approach. But again, we don't have too many of our aircraft that have it.
I think, by the way, Keith, I think your audio is a little choppy. I don't know if there's something running on your computer.
Is it? Sorry, not sure how. Yeah, not sure how much I can do with that. I'm currently at war with Comcast to hopefully get a little better to get our internet a little faster. So let me know if it gets any worse, and we'll just switch off. Okay. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about engine power reduced. We do. We're going to take this a little more from the perspective of at altitude. George already talked to you about, and Colonel Vita already talked to you about the impossible turn. What happens on takeoff when you're at 1,000 feet or less off the ground? Let's take it from a different perspective. We're en route, and we have some things to think about. In some ways, this can be slightly more difficult because you have more time and more choices. When you're less than 1,000 feet off the ground, you don't have choices. But here we may. So fundamentally, I'm really into flows, right? And my flows follow checklists. So you'll find that I'm going to recommend a flow. Remember your ABCs and D and E. And you'll find that it really mirrors pretty much what the checklist does. So what is it? Airspeed. This is first and foremost. The moment you, and it is the item, the moment you realize that you're in an engine failure or reduced power situation, set your airspeed, right? And this will require trimming. Airspeed, it's not going to happen immediately. Happening, go to B, start looking for your best field. Again, go back to A, your airspeed should be coming to your best, your trimming, back to best field. Start turning towards it. It's not like we can have too much altitude when we arrive at the designated landing area. Okay, so we're heading to our field. We have our glide airspeed dialed in, our best glide airspeed dialed in. CAWG check. Can we fix the problem? Tank on one side and it's an empty tank. Don't know. Do we have a fuel pump failure? Could the emergency or the electrical driven fuel troubleshooting checklist needs to be by now? You're going to walk through the checklist items here, which will include things like turning on the electrical fuel pump to see if it makes a difference. Okay, we've run through this list. Best field at nothing has worked. Time for the distress call. Keep in mind the distress call is a ways down here because that distress call is unlikely to do anything for us while we're still in the air. Might be helpful. They might be able to pick out a field for us or a nearest airport, but for the most part, it's our responsibility at this point. What the primary purpose of the distress call is going to be that when we successfully and safely make it onto the ground somewhere, someone comes and gets us. And then finally, E, prepare for and execute your emergency power off landing. Again, you've got your checklist out. This is on the checklist. This is the part where this comes a little late, in my opinion, checklist, like briefing your crew and passengers, opening the door potentially, turning off the power once flaps have been set for landing. These are your final steps in the actual emergency landing. Let me take just a second here and say that, talk about the briefing the passengers. Now, I don't know how many of you have had situations where your passengers or crew start to get uptight. But I will tell you, and I don't think I'm the only one, that nothing actually makes me uptight than when my crew and passengers start to become unhinged. Right? Not even the actual problem at hand or anything else, I find as distracting as when are feeling very upset and are concerned. So brief your passengers and your crew early and often. This is the big role of the PIC. It's maintain that calm. You may not be calm on the inside, but you need to present the calm. This is all part of your job. This is why we practice this, so that it becomes more of a learned response. And you actually have the ability to remain more calm. Brief your passengers early. Keep them calm. And in turn, you'll find you're probably more calm too. All of our POHs have a maximum glide. Right? I think maximum is well stated. These are the best possible case conditions. As we added to this slide, essentially keep in mind, these are created by test pilots. This is test computer modeling and test pilot flown, right? Now, if we're nervous, we're upset about things, are we as good as a test? Not sure. So the issue here is, and we talked about this even on the impossible turn, always add margins. And we'll talk about that in the upcoming procedures.
Keith, did you advance the
The
slide?
other thing,
because we're still looking at the APC.
Okay, I did. It advances. Let me go back.
Okay, kind of looks frozen. Maybe you want to reshare. At least it looks to me. I don't know. Does anybody else see?
Yeah, it looks frozen.
Same ABC.
Okay, so there's the gliding slide. Keith, still there? Okay. Keith, let me get the slides real quick. Maybe we might have to continue. I don't know. Keith, can you hear us? Okay, well, while I pull up the slide, let me ask you folks, what affects the glide ratio? So compared to these numbers that you see here, is there anything we can do to improve it? I see a raised hand. Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead, Francis. Okay, Andre.
Hi. Yeah, I also don't have, I guess, hard data for this, but maybe changing the pitch on the propeller could help a little bit with some of the glide speed. But we're talking sort of marginal increase, I suppose. But who knows? Maybe those extra, 50, 100 feet might be worth it.
Yeah, so that's a good one. So let me also acknowledge that somebody on chat said glide with the wind. That means a tailwind, and that is a great point. If you glide with a tailwind, you'll glide farther. Also, what Andrew's saying is, if you're in a 182, pull the RPM knob all the way back. That means that the RPM is going to decrease, and that decreases the drag. Now, how dramatic is that effect? Well, go ahead and try it. It's one of the things that we can do with this flight clinic, which is, do your checklist and everything. And then at the very end, when you're pretending that you want to glide towards somewhere, pull the RPM all the way back, keep that speed constant, see what happens to your vertical speed. Big word of caution, when you terminate this maneuver, put the RPM knob back full forward before applying power. And I say this because we're not used to thinking about that when we recover, like in a go around, because the RPM knob is supposed to be all the way in. But please do that. So, and by the way, for at least my experience, if I remember right, in a 182, it was about 100 or 200 feet per minute. So it's something. It can definitely make a difference. Okay, what can you do to make your glide ratio worse? And folks, I don't see raised hands because I'm sharing my screen, so please speak up.
For me, whenever I do this maneuver, I tend to pitch up.
Yeah, so speed control. If it's not perfect, yeah, exactly right.
Flying uncoordinated.
Yes, thank you. That increases drag. So, and those are things that are easy to happen, if you're stressed out and everything. So, what about flaps? Are flaps going to improve or worsen the glide distance?
It depends how many flaps. Flaps 10 would increase it. They give you more lift than drag. Flaps 20 is about 50% lift, 50% parasite drag, and also induced drag. And then full flaps are just parasite drag.
Okay. I mean, you're right that higher degrees is more drag, but I would caution you because remember, let's go back to the POH. The POH doesn't say put 10 degrees of flaps to extend your glide. It only says put flaps to make the final landing. So I would question whether that's the case, but it's a nice opportunity to go test it. The other thing is that graph we saw was with flaps up, so we're not exactly sure what the glide ratio does, but in any case. And then maneuvering, turning, more drag, you lose a component of lift during the turn, so I can also make things worse.
How about not taking advantage of thermals or mountain waves?
You must be a glider pilot. So, yes, for those of us who are glider, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that because I'm not a glider pilot. I wish I was, but I'm not. For those of you who are a glider pilot, well, first off, good for you. But you've also learned some things that are really cool, like as we said, like mount waves, lifts, reading the winds. You've also learned how to adjust your glide speed depending on the headwind or tailwind component. This is something that powered airplane folks don't really learn, unfortunately, but it is what it is. So these are all cool things you can do. Now, how you can judge your glide performance? You lost your engine. There's an airport somewhere. Can you make it? We talked about the spot method. The spot method is pretty accurate. It does, however, make the assumption, quote unquote, that the winds are going to remain the same. I mean, it tells you what's going on right now, but as you descend, the winds might change. So that's going to change things. So if it's marginal, whether you're going to make it, that might make a difference. You can make calculations. The people here use ForeFlight and they have that glide vector around their little airplane.
Yes.
But not vector. It's like
Yes.
an area. Yeah. Okay. Make sure that knows your airplane and that knows your winds. Otherwise, it's garbage in, garbage out. But yeah. By the way, if Keith is back, I cannot see who's in, so just speak up. right.
I'm back on, but I'm let you continue. I'm still struggling to get the slides back up.
Okay. All right, and this is a graph from an FAA airplane handbook. So with more headwind, that might make a difference between making it and not making it. Again, I refer you to a lot of glider related articles I'm not going to cover here, but basically the glide speed can depend on the wind conditions as well. Also, if you look at the graph on the top, so the base glide speed is by definition the best glide speed. It will take you the farthest. If you're faster, you won't go as far. If you're slower, you won't go as far. If you are the glide speed, you might be really tempted. You know, we call that the left arm becomes shorter. You might be really tempted to pull back, and that will momentarily arrest your descent, but then you'll start coming down even more. So have that in mind, even though you might be tempted to do something else, maintain that glide speed. So we here talk about a rule of thumb. It's only a rule of thumb. It's not a procedure. It's not something that's gonna work every time. It's a rule of thumb just to make some calculations easier, just to take some load off, or just to, I guess, increase your confidence in what's going on. And it's the 8-on-8. So that takes the 8-to-1 glide ratio we find in a lot of our aircraft. Actually, our Cessnas is more like 8.5 or 9-to-1. But anyway, let's be conservative. A lot of these assumptions here are being conservative. So we take the 8-to-1 glide ratio. We add a fudge factor because, again, we're not test pilots. Conditions are perfect. We're going to be stressed and all that. So what we end up getting at is, for example, at 8,000 feet AGL, you should be able to glide at least 8 miles. By the book, it's actually more. It's actually a little over 10 miles. But we're saying 8 miles because imperfections. Again, it's the fudge factor. And that nicely creates this rule of thumb that says, take the 1,000 feet altitude you are, AGL, not MSL, and that will give you that number, how many thousand feet, that will give you how many miles you can glide with a fudge factor. Again, it depends on many things. Also depends on the winds. If you're flying G1000, look at that wind vector. But if your target where you want to go is within that 8-to-8 rule, so say you're 1,000 feet, if you want to go somewhere that's 6 miles away, you'll probably make it. If it's beyond, but within the 8-to-1 that the book says, well, that's where you get paid the big bucks. That's where you use your judgment and good flying. If it's outside the 8-to-1, probably cannot make it unless you have a healthy amount of tailwind. So go somewhere else. And there's another sorry, that was a sneak preview, but I also wanted to remind you something else. Say that you have this ideal target that you really want to get to. You lost your engine and you see an airport and you really want to get there because it's going to be graceful. Nobody's going to get hurt. Even the plane is not going to be bent. Great. The question is, how sure are you that you're going to make it? Because if that's your perfect target, but you're not sure you're going to make it, that means that you have to consider what other options there are near that target, because you might get within 2 miles and say, oh, turns out I cannot make it. Now what? If the now what is house number 1 or house number 2, well, you might consider when you first made that choice to land on that nice, beautiful green or brown grass strip that's right below you that you know that you definitely can make. Keith, are you able to take over? You want to take over?
Yeah, I can. When you're ready, you can give your next preview slide that you wanted to take over after that. See if it works.
Okay. Well, no, you can talk to that. We can switch later schedule. Go ahead.
All right.
I can share if you want. Yeah.
See if I get it. Yep, I think I got it.
You're hard to hear.
Am I hard to hear? How about now? Am I a little better?
Better.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the technical problems. All right, so we'll go back to George's slide. So I think this is what George was alluding to here. If you take a look, what we've got here is over, I think, our Cirrus out the windscreen of our Cirrus here. We're looking at a truck coming right in front of us. So yeah, the reality of the situation could certainly be more intense. So we never want to rely on absolute numbers. We always want to have margins, because our performance is generally not going to be the best when we're in the middle of a emergency situation. Let's talk about the descent and landing now. So we've talked about where we want to go, how we're thinking about it. How do we actually execute it? We're going to recommend that you divide this into 2 parts, right? Just break it down to simple problems that we can solve. The first step is what we've been talking about now, is fly and descend, obviously, to a position where you are downwind, abeam the numbers at 1,000 feet AGL. So why do we do that? Well, isn't that pretty much what we do every time we come into land? So what we're looking to do is create a situation where we're most used to doing the same things over again. All about muscle memory, all about training. So from 1,000 feet AGL, abeam the numbers, you ought to be able to perform a power off spot landing. But frankly, in an emergency situation, if you can actually do a power off landing and make it into your surface that you're aiming for, great. That's what we're looking to do. All right, start by choosing landing spots within reach. That was the whole purpose of the 8-on-8, or knowing your 8-to-1 glide ratio, or using your ForeFlight with your green ring. Find your spot, make sure it's in reach. As George talked about, an imperfect spot is probably a better decision if you know you can reach it rather than one you can't. Because stretching eliminates options if you come up short. You are out of energy. Once you're out of energy, you're done. So the objective is we'd like to be at or above 1,000 feet AGL, downwind, abeam the landing point. So abeam the numbers, just like we do when we normally land. Otherwise, we're going to aim for upwind over the numbers. Now, is it that simple? I don't know. There's always going to be new situations that you have to encounter. But if we really break it down to the ways that we typically come into an airport and land, what we're really doing is, I don't care if it's Farmer John's field or a road or some other or a soccer field, some other off-field landing spot. The point is, treat it like an airport that you should be used to going to. So again, we arrive downwind to be in the numbers, or either upwind over the numbers. Probably better to have a little more altitude there. We're proposing 1,000 feet plus half your observed turning altitude loss. Huh, what does that mean? Well, for every aircraft you fly, you should have a rough idea of how much altitude you're going to lose for each 360-degree turn. So here's a procedure. Do this on emergency procedures clinic. As you're climbing up and you're having a simulated engine failure, you've reached your airport or off-field landing site that you want to come down on, go ahead and let's do this. Let's put the power at idle. And we're going to time 20 and 30 degree, or excuse me, we're going to measure 20 and 30 degree bank angles. Best glide configuration, flaps as appropriate, or gear, depending on for the aircraft you're at. And I put the prop knob in red here. I'm not a fan of pulling the prop knob, early, pulling the propeller back early. Particularly in training, it's a risky problem, because as you start to apply power to do your go around or come out of the procedure, it puts a lot of strain on the engine if you have that prop back. So I prefer to look at the propeller as potentially a last minute emergency reserve, enough to maybe get you over the fence if you need it. Different people have different opinions on this. The key is, though, if you are going to do something like this, beware it needs to be pushed back in before you do any sort of a go around, before you apply power. So why do we do this? Well, the whole purpose of this here, and I will tell you, this comes from years of flight instruction experience, is that when we do off-field or simulated emergency landing procedures, I have seen people go every direction in this effort to lose altitude. And more than not, what I've seen is that by the time they get turned around and I ask them, so where were we landing? And they're out looking for it and they have no clue where their original spot was. Or if they actually pick it out, they have now lost so much energy, they have no chance of getting back to it. So part of this procedure is to give you the tools that you need so that you understand how many turns can I make staying over the same area, right? Rather than just flying straight ahead and away. Talk more about it, but keep in mind that as you turn around from downwind to upwind, it's going to obviously take you longer to get back where you started from. Whereas if you maintain your position and you can use these numbers to figure out what does it take to, how much do I actually lose? So this turns out to be a fun experiment because most people don't really, if they haven't done it before, they don't really have an idea. And when I ask people to estimate, I've gotten some really interesting numbers in terms of how much altitude you actually lose. And not only that, how much do you lose at 20 degrees versus 30 degrees? Anybody out there want to give a guess for basically the same conditions? What the altitude loss is at 20 degrees versus 30 degrees of bank? Not the amount, but which one is greater? Anybody have any thoughts?
Will clearly be greater, unless I'm wrong and it's not so clear.
I'm sorry, which one?
30 degrees, the larger bank angle would give a steeper descent.
Okay, so you'd lose more altitude in the 30-degree bank angle, is your thought?
Sir.
Okay. Well, it'll be an interesting one to try because that's not generally the experience we have. It turns out in most cases, getting yourself around the turn it happens fast enough or faster than the amount of altitude that you lose at best glide airspeed. In fact, in a 182, and these are not atypical numbers, you might find that your descent number is about 800 feet for every 20 degree bank circle, 600 feet for a 30-degree bank circle. Depending on your technique, might be a little bit higher. Might be 1,000 and maybe 750 or 800, for the 20-degree bank. But the purpose for this is so that I can descend over my airport and have an idea. If I'm at 2,000 feet, can I make a full circle? If you had no idea what the numbers were, you might not try it. You might at 2,000 feet start flying downwind. And then deciding when to come back. And would you turn back in time to make it again? So if you arrive downwind and beam the numbers at 1,500 feet AGL with the numbers above, what would you do? Would you make another circle? Would you fly downwind? So if I used a 30-degree bank angle and made a circle, I'd be down to about 900 AGL. We can probably make a spot landing on the airport at 900 feet AGL. That's not too far off from what we're used to doing. About 1,200 feet.
Watch it, Marianne.
I'm sorry, was there a comment?
Tony's, yeah, okay.
Yes, turns.
Yes, turns, yeah. So 1,200 feet, probably not as much. I probably would use the other tools in my toolbox. Okay, so we basically learned how to get ourselves down. I'm sorry, did I have a question?
Yeah, I said you can try a slip.
Absolutely. Slips, S-turns, and I'll bring those up again in a couple slides. So let's look at it graphically here. Is a couple choices. Arrive over the numbers at 1,000 feet plus now half our turn altitude. So now we're looking at it and now you have an answer. Is if you're going to end up in the overhead position or the high key position as the military calls it, if you're going to end up in that position, how high do you want to be? Well, Let's try for about 1,000 feet and what half the turn would be. So as we looked at for those 182 numbers, at a 30-degree bank angle, we only lose about 600 feet or so in a full turn. So a half turn may only be about 300 or so feet. So arriving over the numbers, upwind, 1,400 feet, looks just about perfect. Start your downwind turn, you should be about 1,000 feet of beam the numbers. Okay, so keep in mind, by the way, the airplane goes the same way the wind direction switched here. So now I am actually downwind. So now we've hit downwind, we've arrived, beam the numbers, 1,000 feet AGL or higher. Okay, essentially our low key position, if you will. What do we do? Land the plane. Pick your spot on the runway. Third of the way down. I don't know if it's a third, maybe it's a quarter. The issue here is this is not the time to come up short, right? So don't pick the very threshold of your landing area, especially if the area prior to that is unhospitable. Pick a point in front of it. Here's the reason. Even though I'm wasting a little bit of my potential space by aiming further down, here's the thing. If I come up short, I end up impacting whatever that unhospitable terrain is at 70 knots. That's a lot of energy there. If instead I pick a spot down and I end up running off the end of my runway or landing area, let's say I even hit a tree at 10 knots. Which is more survivable? Right? The old adage they talk about in the highway safety commercials about speed kills. It's true. We have a lot more energy if we're going to hit an object at 70 knots than we are if we bump into a tree at 10 knots. Plane might not be reusable. You may get a little bruised, but you'll probably walk away. So don't come up short. That's the purpose for that one. Okay, let's just review. Power off landing from 1,000 feet. We should be practicing this regularly. Many of you are probably asked to do this on a Form 5, so you should be preparing for it if for no other reason than that. Be mindful of the headwind component, right? Because this is what you're going to be fighting when you turn onto final. And if you've misjudged, you could end up short. Being long is not a problem. We have all kinds of tools. Several of you gave me some ideas already. You have several tools in your arsenal there. But ending up short, you have a lot less. Avoid extending downwind because, and this is subjective, but I have found this to bear out, it almost always takes longer and more altitude to get back than you expect. Especially the stronger the wind gets, we tend not to judge it well. And I'm speaking for myself as well. I do this stuff pretty regularly, and I still tend to misjudge if I extend my downwind. Instead, use your other tools. So we talked about slips, talked about S-turns. We certainly have flaps. How about reducing the airspeed? If I reduce my airspeed, my aircraft actually starts to sink better and I cover less ground while I'm descending. Now, if you do that, certainly watch your airspeed. You do not want to end up at your rollout or your round out point for your landing at minimum controllable airspeed, because you still need enough energy to arrest your descent to be able to basically flare your aircraft. So even if you use the technique of slowing the aircraft down to sink, make sure as you get closer to the ground, you consider adding airspeed to give yourself the energy you need. Because once your energy's out, you're really out of options. Here's another one. I think it sounded like we may have had some glider pilots in the audience. What portion, downwind, base, or final? Where is the big decision points made? I mean, I know glider pilots have told me time and again, this is where they look at it. It's that base turn. When you have the base turn, you're actually starting to head towards your point, or at least in the direction of your point. You have your first good indication of where your spot is and how you're making progress towards it. If you're high, extend your base out. Turn a little bit away, or make a shorter base turn, if you will. Turn away from the landing spot to widen it out. If you're short, then you're direct to the numbers. So big decision point on base to make those the decisions of how you're doing. Okay. Couple thoughts on increasing your odds. Engine failure is probably the most hazardous during takeoff and climb. And again, if for no other reason, if you think about it from an energy management point of view, it is the point in time where you have the least reserve energy available to you to choose what to do. So when you have unhospitable terrain or landing areas nearby, consider some of the following. Make sure you climb and gain your airspeed as much as possible. I'm not necessarily proposing VX. VX has its own set of issues to it, but at least maintain your VY. At least get all the altitude that you reasonably can while you're at the airport. I do find a lot of people tend to start accelerating beyond VY well below 1,000 feet. You should probably be maintaining at least VY to 1,000 feet. Consider if the terrain really, like you're coming out of a mountain airport, or you're in a valley somewhere where you don't have a lot of options, consider taking another lap in the pattern to gain altitude. Always start your takeoff roll at the full length of the runway. What does the old adage say? The most useless things? I think one of them is the runway behind you. And know what other airports are close by in case you have to make an alternate. It's interesting because when Colonel Vita described it, he immediately came up and said, well, we couldn't go there, that was too far. We couldn't go there, that was too far. Why? Because they knew where their other airports were. And again, I mentioned this earlier, arrive at the airport at your highest reasonable altitude. There is no being too high when you're over your landing spot. Gives you plenty of time. You can troubleshoot, you can prepare your crew and passengers, prepare your aircraft, make a radio call. All of those things can happen. So always conserve whatever altitude you can. Use this in your choosing of whatever landing field you're going to pick. The closer one that you assuredly can make and make safely is better than the one that's a stretch. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to George for the next slide.
And as promised, this is where we make a plan at Oakland, because Oakland is an interesting case, not the only one, but certainly one of the interesting ones. So you see on the left side, left bottom of the slide, you see that airplane. That's where we're starting, and that is roughly where the where Kappa 81 actually lives. And then you see the wind. That big red arrow is the wind vector. We're gonna go through two exercises. First, we're gonna pick a runway for departure, and we're gonna talk about what kind of different risks each of them presents. And the second is we're gonna make a plan, a contingency plan. What do we do if we lose our engine at different altitudes? So what can somebody take a stab or to share their opinion on what runway would they use? And really the big contenders here are the 28s, typically 28 right. These are the long runways, or runway 33, which is the short runway. Yeah, okay.
Typically, you take off on 28 right every time I've been there.
Why?
It's favorable to the wind. It's a longer runway. You have to make a pretty immediate right turn to avoid some of the condos and Alameda and all that. But and it keeps you vectored away from the big jet traffic.
So runway 33 also keeps you vectored away from jet traffic. You don't have to make the turn to Alameda, but it is a shorter runway. That's true. And also how the wind is presented here, it's kind of like it's favoring somewhat equally, both 33 and 28 right. Think more than just the runways. What is ahead of the runways? If you're taking off a 33, you lose the altitude. There's no runway remaining. there's a band of altitudes where you can't really do anything, but you're going to be swimming pretty quickly. There's that water straight ahead. 2-8 right doesn't have that issue. It has, well, other issues, of course. He has a golf course. Golf courses, I mean, there have been successful landings on them, but it's not like they are the ideal site, but definitely has worked. There are some, I know that's hard to see, but there are some fields ahead, like some special fields and so on. Let me ask you this. You're taking off a 2-8 right. You don't have enough runway remaining to land back on the same runway. What are your options at the point? So as soon as you run out of runway for 2-8 right, what's your next option?
Maybe turn to 3-3 if you can.
Exactly. You can make a nice right turn, shallow turn to 3-3. If you take off from 3-3, you don't have that option. All right, you're taking from 2-8 right. Now you can no longer land on 3-3. What's your next option? You know, there's a road that's sort of vertical to 2-8 right.
Golf course?
There's a road. You can make a 90-degree right or left turn. Of course, it's a road. It has traffic, but that road is not busy usually. And then there's the golf course. And then there are some fields that I know you can't really see those, but there are some fields. And if you're too high to make all the golf course or the fields, where you're probably high enough to turn back. And as somebody said before, you don't have to land on 2-8 right. You can make a left turn and land on the opposite of 2-8 left, so 10 right. So 2-8 right is longer runway, but it also has more options. I'm not saying that 3-3 you should never use, but this is part of your risk management and your decision making. There are definitely other practical considerations at Oakland. Like sometimes they close 3-0, so all the airliners are using 2-8 right and left. So that case you might just avoid them. But this is part of your pre-flight planning, your briefing with your crew, and your risk management. Andre.
Yeah, hi. I guess we haven't covered this, and also situation dependent, but we haven't sort of talked about much like about the surface sort of selection, and especially like when we're in the area near sort of the ocean or we have all these inlets. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on sort of trying to land in the waterway. I personally feel like it's more dangerous, even if, let's say, there's not a smooth field. I think it's more dangerous landing in the water. I think maybe sometimes you might be drawn to the water because there's less obstacles and it looks smooth. But can you guys comment on this? If it's just my perception that water is more dangerous than sort of crashing and tumbling, I guess, on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, obviously it depends. I would encourage everybody here to take the water survival course from CAP, although that kind of only scratches the surface, honestly. There are statistics for GA that say that water is more survivable than we think, but does that mean it's more survivable than a golf course? I don't have the numbers on that. In any case, landing on water requires a little bit of a different technique if you want to do it optimally. Refer to your POH, the teaching procedure. It's a little different than the landing on a field procedure. But it's complicated and it can definitely go wrong. Now, it really is a judgment call. Again, we cannot give you an answer to anything. This is why so at the pre-flight stage that we are right now, you should make this assessment. The water in this case is protected, so you're not going to get waves. The golf course might be busy. The fields might belong to a school that's in session. I mean, the time of the day matters as well. It also depends, quite frankly, what's your physical state, how well you can swim, and your passengers. So I don't have an answer to that, honestly. It's just that you have to make your planning. But I would, as a personal preference, I would tend to avoid water if I can, because it's complicated. But
yeah, I think my sort of hunch is that a lot of times, I mean, you know, we have shoulder harness, but a lot of times you can still sort of bang your head on the dashboard, and when you impact, I mean, there's a moment where you might lose consciousness, and it's just really difficult to like leave the airplane like within 20-30 seconds. I think basically there's such a high risk of drowning and hypothermia and drowning that Yeah, it would be sort of my last resort. I guess that's just my hunch. I'm asking.
There definitely more risk. So the same article that I was talking about also makes the argument that planes don't flip as much as we think we do, although they definitely can flip, but that's an extra risk here. Again, not going to give you answers. All what you're saying are valid points. Again, I personally like to avoid the water, but like in this case, I think there are better options. Even if you just look at the north of the golf course, or actually up from the figure from the north golf course, there's this brown field that might be just better to land at. So anyway, I know, Keith, do you have anything to add here?
No, not really. It's I think the most important point is actually understanding what your area around your airport is, what your runway and road options and everything are right here, and not be so committed. If you decide you're coming back to the airport, you may pick, as George said, you might pick a different runway. Once you're done with your turn, making the parallel runway is probably closer if you've turned, for example, left off 28 right, then 28 left or 10 right becomes the better option potentially. So don't be so fixated. Study ahead of time, be prepared, and you have options.
Okay, all right. That was a great question, though. Really, thanks for that. All right, next slide. So something that I like to. So what you see here is a situation where you've lost your electricity. Remember the electrical malfunction discussion we had before. So if you've lost your main battery and then half an hour went by trying to get to an airport. Now if you lost your standby battery, which means you lost both of your screens and you've lost flaps because your main battery, remember those are connected and G1000, those are connected to the main battery, not the standby. So now you have to land with no flaps and only using your standby instruments. This is something that should not create an emergency. So this is something that I personally like to recreate in Form 5, and I encourage folks to simulate this in this clinic. So dim.pfd, do not use reversionary mode. So the only airspeed indication you get or altitude or an altitude are the standby instruments, and don't use flaps. Right, next slide. And yep, click. Okay, so as we said, this no flap landings or partial flap landings should be considered abnormal. But to make it clear, this is assuming a symmetrical flap failure where flaps on both sides are still on the same degree setting. Click. If you have an asymmetrical flap failure, that is an emergency because it affects the controllability of your aircraft. Now you have two wings and they're giving you different amounts of lift. Click. So, but that's not something that we should or can simulate in this clinic. So yeah, practice partial no flap landings on your flight. We've talked about no flap landings, but you can also practice landing with 10 degrees of flap or 20 degrees of flaps. Because as Keith said earlier on, if you have an alternator failure, well, you might only want to use go around flap settings, which means that you might be landing with 10 degrees of flaps, and see what that does. You get more lift than with no flaps. So, and refer to your POH for what that does to your approach speed. For the Cessna 182 G1000s, no flaps is plus 10 knots, for example, and it's going to change your side picture as well. Click. Okay, unusual altitude recovery. So these are mandatory in the Form 5 evaluation, even for VFR, and they're mandatory for a reason, because if we do get inadvertently in IMC, in a VFR flight, well, there's a chance that we might not control the airplane very well for various reasons, stress, lack of skill with the instruments, what have you. So if you find yourself in instrument conditions, your first indication that you're in an unusual attitude could be sound. It could be now, if you're picking up speed, you might hear the wind sort of whooshing fast, and that can grab your attention. If you're too slow, it might be the opposite. You might, the controls might feel mushy. You might even hear the stall warning, of course. But remember all the indications that you noticed during slow flight and what's different between slow flight and cruise, and all of those can happen in an unusual attitude with the nose high when you're losing speed. So yeah, and you could get more, I guess, abnormal or rapid indication of the attitude instruments, maybe the altitude as well. Okay, next. So the first thing to do, unusual attitude, is to know what kind of attitude you're in. It will make the situation a lot worse to apply the procedure for one unusual attitude when you're in the other. And you shouldn't rush too much to make the determination because you need to get it right, but at the same time, it's not like you have all day. So after in the traditional six-pack, your first job is to look at the airspeed indicator. Now, of course, this does depend on the aircraft because, what's the traditional six-pack, you might have electronic instruments, so on. The reason behind this is that the mechanical AIs, and it does depend on exactly what design they have, they might tumble if the attitude is a little too exciting. But your airspeed indicator will remain reliable. So if the airspeed is increasing, you're likely in a nose down situation. Okay, click. In a G1000 or equivalent, what that means is could be the Aspen, could be other sides of electronic indicators. That tumbling is usually not a problem. Again, you have to know your plane, but the aircraft is very unlikely to become unreliable. Now, I'll put an asterisk here and say that in failure modes in G1000, we all have seen the big red axis that will go in an attitude indicator, for example, if it fails. That does not necessarily happen right away. You might have a failure that gives you some false readings before you get at that X. So it's not like you will look at the G1000 attitude and just trust it. You still have to cross-check and verify. But the reality is the aircraft is very likely to become unreliable. So you can look at that first. In all cases, you need to cross-check and verify still. That does not change. Okay, next. So this is a nose down situation. So what G1000 does, and many other equivalent systems, is if you're in an unusual altitude, it gives you those red chevrons that tell you where you should go. And it also simplifies the PFD. It actually takes away some things because it doesn't want to confuse you. Again, it might be a time sensitive situation here, depending on how exciting it is. But this is what nose down looks like. There's a lot of brown, right? You have higher speed, your altitude is decreasing, you have chevrons telling you to go up. That is the nose down situation. Click. Power to idle. We don't want to pick up more speed than we already are. Next. All right, level the wings. Can somebody tell me why we want to level the wings before trying to raise the nose?
Yes, in order not to overstress the airframe.
Right, but let me ask you this. If you try to raise the nose before leveling the wings, will you recover or
I have an accelerated stall speed, so I might be stalling.
You might, yeah.
Might spin.
So spin requires a stall, and accelerated stall is also a stall. That can definitely happen, but if you're at 150 knots, you need to pull way back, and please don't do that. We don't want to overstress the airframe. Something I should have clarified here. Yes, our control input should be confident, but not too abrupt, because we might bend something.
If you level the wings, it's the shortest way to level flight.
Okay, so what I'm looking for, folks, is if you don't level the wings and you pull back, you're just going to make the spiral towards the ground tighter. That's called a graveyard spiral. And really, the nose is not going to raise necessarily. If you're in a 60-degree bank and you pull back, I mean, you might raise the nose some, but you really just couldn't tighten the turn. And at the very least, you're going to stress the plane and take way longer to recover. So that's why we say level the wings first. And click next is pull the nose now for level altitude. Now in reality, you can do both level the wings and raise the nose at the same time. Again, be firm with the controls, but gentle, because it doesn't do much good to recover if you're gonna damage the airplane and affect its controllability. But yeah, anyway, all right. So this is the nose down case. Let's go next slide. Nose up. Similar situation, there's a little blue now instead of brown. You're going to see the airspeed decreasing. You're going to see the altitude increasing. You might hear stall horning. You might notice the controls are mushy. This is sort of the opposite. We want to add power to prevent the altitude, slow down the airspeed loss, and push nose down and level the wings. I think we have that. Yeah, and and level the wings. There's no graveyard spiral case here. That's why it's okay to push the nose down before leveling the wings. Again, in reality, you can do the same. You can do them at the same time. Don't push too much because then you're going to start descending. Level the wings, and depending on your situation on the aircraft, you have to make a determination how you know when you're at level altitude. Well, in G1000, it's easier. If you have a mechanical AI, well, you don't necessarily trust it, but look at your altimeter. When it stops moving up or down, well, it was moving up before because you were nose up, but when it stops increasing altitude, well, that's about level. All right, next. All right, other fun things. Landing without elevator control. Well, read the POH, please. But in this case, in the G1000 182, the POH just basically tells you to establish 80 knots with the trim because, well, you don't have the elevator, and then control the glide angle by the power. And then last part of that is basically you're going to try to flare using the trim. It might not be pretty, but might be safe enough to land. Again, that's something that we cannot and should not simulate, but that is what the POH says for this situation. It does happen. It's unlikely, but it does happen. All right, next. Landing with a flat main tire, well, you're going to try to keep the weight off that flat tire for as long as possible. Normal approach, I mean, before the tires touch the runway, nothing really changes. The POH here wants you to land with full flaps because it wants you to minimize the forward speed when you do touch down. Try to touch down on the good main tire first. This might mean that you're going to be looking for crosswind to make that easier. Because you don't have any crosswind, and how you're going to touch on the good main tire first without veering off the runway, well, that's kind of tough. But with a crosswind here actually makes it easier. And try to control, try to have directional control using the brake or the good wheel. That might be hard. But you can also expect that the plane would want to turn towards the side of the bad tire, so maybe you want to land a little bit on the other side of the center line, if the runway is long enough. Landing with a flat nose tire. Question, how would you even know you have a flat nose tire?
Thorough pre-flight.
Thorough pre-flight. I have a story to share.
Overfly the tower.
Yeah, but I mean, you're not going to do that every time, right? If you have a reason to suspect it, you might. But the question is, how do you even suspect it?
You might have felt something on takeoff.
Okay, Asish and I have a story to share because we actually had that happen. And the situation was that, you know, we tested the air pressure for the nose wheel like we did with every other tire. The valve apparently didn't close, but it was slowly leaking. Everything was normal taking off, and of course doing the air work. But when we came back, like touch and goes didn't feel exactly normal, but it was just kind of slight. Definitely when we wanted to exit the runway, the airplane was hard to control. So no, not a threatening situation, but it definitely was interesting to experience that. No, we did not know there was a flat tire. We suspected this. Did you feel that? But it was really subtle on touch and go, because I should have clarified. It wasn't entirely flat. It was just really low pressure. Yeah. All right. And then I think that's it for this slide. Next. All right. Find an instructor. Click. Yeah, so PCR has mobile tools to find CAPF. This does not tell you who the authorized mentor pilots are for this flight clinic. Please talk to your group DO or DOV, whoever is the point of contact for it, but you can at least find an IP through the mobile tools, check pilots or instructor pilots. What you're looking for is an instructor pilot airplane. If you want to do this in a G1000, also instructor pilot G1000. Click. And as we said, groups can authorize non-IP mentor pilots. I mean, the intention here is to make it logistically easier, but these non-IPs should be experienced pilots who are also capable of gaining control or at least terminating something that is unsafe or it's going out of control. I remember what Keith said earlier about the 3,000 to 5,000 feet for power of landings. Next. There is a syllabus. There is a flight syllabus. It's on Teams. I don't know how to Keith, can you send the link and put it in the chat maybe? Because it might help. But it does live on Teams, and it is a flight syllabus. It says what you can do and has some suggestions. You can document it, but we'd like you to cover at least some of the things in the syllabus. Otherwise, it's not really an emergency flight procedures, right? So, and what you'll see in the syllabus is things we talked about. There is some flexibility, of course. Discuss options with your instructor pilot. Please talk to them. Tell them what you want to accomplish. Tell them what you want to focus on. There's flexibility there for a reason, because you have different backgrounds, different skill levels. You can focus on G1000. You can talk about, I don't know, other stuff. It really is up to you. Yep, next. And please try to limit the shortage for to about 1.5 hubs, just for finance reasons, so that everybody gets to play. And remember, don't create an emergency while practicing for an emergency. Remember the regulatory discussion we had before, but don't do anything that's outside the what you're comfortable with and outside the recommendations that we talked about. If you really want to go for it, talk to your instructor pilot if you want to change something. But any of the crew members can terminate maneuver. You don't have to question that at the moment. Just terminate, go to a safe altitude, configuration. Then you can talk about it, or on the ground. But don't start an argument in a deteriorating situation. Just terminate. I'll talk about it later. Next.